afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Monroe Carmen. I'm president of the club and editor-at-large at Bloomberg Business News. I'd like to welcome our club members in the audience with their guests, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio or the Global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, which is a very distinguished head table today, I would like to remind our members of future speakers. On Tuesday, May 16th, Sarah Brady of Handgun Control and Tanya Mataxa of the National Rifle Association will debate the assault weapons ban and assorted gun control issues. And on Wednesday, May 17th, Myrlie Evers Williams of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People talks about affirmative action and the lessons of Brown versus the Board of Education. And on May 22nd, comedian Bob Newhart will give us his perspective on political campaigns. They never change, he says, just the faces. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-672-2334. That's a little bit of a change, 1-800-672-2334. If you have any questions now, we have cards on your tables. Write them on those cards, pass them up, and I will ask as many as time permits. This week we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the ending of World War II in Europe, VE Day. I must tell you, during World War II, I had a shiny white helmet and a luminous sash and belt. And I played a rather important role in that conflict. I was a messenger, a civil defense messenger. Fortunately, I was never given any messages to deliver. Fortunately, the United States was neither bombed nor invaded in those years, 1941 to 45. Our guests at the head table, however, came a lot closer to the war than I. They all served our country, and served it well, in different ways during that war to end all wars. Back then, and since then, they have made distinctive contributions both to American journalism, American literature, and American history. So I'm going to depart a little bit from custom and take a few moments to give you brief snapshots of the careers of our guests, but I ask you to hold your applause, please, until all are introduced. From my left and your right, Bill Frank. Much to the anger of publisher Sissy Patterson, the military came into the old Washington Times-Herald and recruited, that's a nice way of saying they grabbed, 8 able-bodied staffers out of the newsroom in 1942. Bill was one of those. He was a Marine Corps combat correspondent in the Solomon Islands and other Pacific campaigns. Donald Lopez, a fighter pilot in World War II. Don flew P-40s in the China Theater under General Chennault, and he was an ace, meaning he shot down 5 or more enemy planes. He flew F-86s in the Korean conflict and was an early Air Force jet test pilot. He's been deputy director of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and still serves as a senior advisor there. The latest of his 4 books is just out. Ken Blackshaw, from the Nantucket Enquirer and Mirror, he got his first lieutenant wings and piloted B-17 bombers with the U.S. 8th Air Force over Europe. Ken is current commander of the National Press Club American Legion post. Austin Kiplinger, after service as a Navy career pilot in the war in the South Pacific, he helped launch the magazine Changing Times. Later, he was a columnist for the Chicago Journal of Commerce an ABC and NBC newsman in Chicago, an editor, an author. He's been a member of the National Press Club for 50 years. And now he has some association with Kiplinger Washington editors. Joe Layton, an old friend of mine, was a Reuters war correspondent in the Pacific. He covered the Japanese surrender 50 years ago in September on the battleship Missouri. He became a reliable source for newsmen as spokesman at the Pentagon, the Treasury, deputy press secretary at the White House, and later he was ombudsman for the Washington Post. Don Larrabee, a correspondent and public affairs officer for the Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater. Sergeant Larrabee was there when MacArthur entered Japan in August 1945. He owned and operated the Griffin Larrabee News Bureau here, serving at one time more than 20 client newspapers. Marvin Stone, my excuse me, former editor. I still choke when I mention that word. Marvin served as a lieutenant aboard a Navy combat ship in the Pacific Theater during the war. He is the former editor of U.S. News and World Report and presently serves as chairman of the International Media Fund. Mark Johnson, a correspondent for Media General News Service and chairman of the MPC Speakers Committee. Hale Montgomery, the member of the club's Speakers Committee who arranged today's luncheon. Hale wants it to be known that in the post-World War II period, he, as a member of the Army Air Corps, clawed his way up the ranks to PFC before his discharge. Larry LeSueur. In 1941, he covered the Nazi invasion of Russia as a CBS correspondent. Before that, he was an assistant to Edward R. Murrow, broadcasting out of London during the Blitz. He landed on the beach on D-Day for CBS. He covered the war, the German surrender, in a little red brick house, a little red schoolhouse in Reims, France, at the end of the war in 1945. Murray Martyr. He enlisted as a cub reporter off the Philadelphia Ledger. He became a combat correspondent with the Marine Corps Raiders in the South Pacific, the Solomons, and Guam. Later, he was foreign correspondent and chief diplomatic reporter for the Washington Post. Robert St. John was an Associated Press correspondent in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, in 1941, when he and other foreign journalists had to flee the invading Nazis. Later, he returned to Europe as an ABC correspondent, broadcasting out of London opposite Edward R. Murrow on CBS. Simon Borgen remembers our speaker as a former colleague on the staff of the Stars and Stripes in the Paris office. Simon also worked for Time, Life, CBS, NBC, and was Newsweek bureau chief in Los Angeles. He was a spokesman for the USIA, the State Department, and others, and is now an advisor to the Aspen Institute. And Don Bishop, another old friend of mine, was a first lieutenant and information officer for the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, in World War II. A North Carolina newsman, he's been a freelance writer and is a recently retired Commerce Department Public Affairs officer. Don. Our luncheon today is entitled 60 Minutes with Andy Rooney. Almost. He's going to get about 50. A writer, author of 10 books, TV producer, syndicated columnist, correspondent with CBS News, essayist for the last 17 years on CBS's 60 Minutes. Andy Rooney began his career as a World War II correspondent in Europe with the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes. Between then and now, he wrote for the Arthur Godfrey Show in the 1950s, The Gary Moore Show in the 1960s. Then moving on to television, he wrote and produced, with Harry Reasoner narrating, a novel series of CBS hard news specials such as an essay on chairs, an essay on bridges, an essay on hotels. Rooney has won all sorts of awards. The Writers Guild Award for Best Script of the Year 6 times. The National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Emmy 3 times for his commentaries on 60 Minutes. This week you could hear Rooney broadcasting from Europe on this anniversary of the end of World War II, or being interviewed on ABC's Prime Time by Sam Donaldson, or dominating the front page of a New York newspaper with his candid comments on the news team of Dan Rather and Connie Chung. I'm sure he's going to get questions about that. But the defining point in Rooney's life must be what he saw and reported as a Stars and Stripes correspondent in Europe. He talked to GIs and generals and world leaders. He flew on bombing missions. He saw the rows of American bodies in the sand when he came ashore on Utah Beach. He toured elegant German castles when U.S. forces crossed the Rhine River. Reminiscing in his latest book, My War, Rooney writes, quote, "It's not possible for anyone who's been in a war to describe the terror of it to someone who hasn't." As a superb storyteller, I'll let him tell his story in his own way. He does it best. It's a pleasure to introduce Andy Rooney.
I get the nervous feeling some of this applause I'm getting is age. As I go on and get older, I notice the applause is more, and I don't think it's because I'm any better than I was. Some of you have heard me speak before and must realize that I'm really not very good at this. I spoke at a group of farmers, agricultural equipment, a few years ago, and they paid me $10,000, and the next day the secretary called me and suggested I give the money back. God knows that can't happen today. But I find myself doing the most ungraceful thing. I'm appearing 3 times in Washington today, outselling my book for Random House. I don't know why writers get trapped into this. I mean, Random House gets 85% of every dollar. I get 15%. The editor, Peter Osnos, a good friend of mine, he used to work for one of your local papers and was a Moscow correspondent, and he asked me to appear last week at the Greenwich Country Club. It belongs to a country club. He said the people there are rich enough to be able to pay $25 for your book. So I spoke there, and I suppose I sold maybe 50 copies. Well, I got doing the arithmetic later, and I figured they took in $1,250, and my 15% was $187.50. Now, if I did that for Random House 5 days a week for 50 weeks a year, I'd clear about $48,875, which would not be anywhere near enough to belong to that country club that he... And here I am here. I mean, C-SPAN, they're making money off this. I mean, NPR is making money. I was going to do this. I always thought, I know they don't do commercials, but I thought I'd force a commercial on C-SPAN. I could leave that up there for 50 minutes, and that would be one hell of a commercial, wouldn't it? When things get dull, I may put it up from time to time. I cannot get over living through this week what a time it was 50 years ago. From the middle of April to the middle of May. I mean, it was an incredible series of events. Roosevelt died. We got to Buchenwald. Ernie Pyle died. He had been with us, First Army, traveling across Europe. He left after Paris. And those of us in the press camp were distraught, because it was interesting that as competitive as the reporters were in those days, no one resented Ernie Pyle. We knew he was the best, and that was the end of that. There was no feeling of competition with Ernie. Then Mussolini was killed. Hitler committed suicide. And we knew the end was coming when we got to Torgau on the Elbe River. And I thought I would tell this story today because I don't know as a wide audience would be interested, but I thought journalists would be interested. And some of you probably are too young to have remembered it. Certainly Larry LeSueur and Cy would know it well. But I find it a fascinating story about journalism. There's always been some confusion about what day VE Day was, May 8th, May 7th, May 9th. And it was declared officially to be May 8th. Well, it was wrong. It should have been May 7th. I don't know why it isn't May 7th. On the late afternoon of May 6th, 17 reporters were called together in Paris, and 4 photographers, and they were told they were being taken on a secret trip. They were flown to Reims, which is impossible to pronounce in France. They have spelled it differently since we were there during the war. It used to have an H in it, and I noticed they've taken the H out, but it doesn't seem to help Americans say "wah" any better. But all those 17 correspondents, reporters knew what they were going on. They were flown to Reims, and Brigadier General Frank Allen, known as Honk Allen, briefed them on board the plane. And he made them swear that they would not write or release the story until he said they could. And his words were, they had his exact words, and it got to be very important to what came out of the story. This story is off the record until the Allied governments announced that fact to the world. Those were Allen's exact words on the plane. Well, in Reims, the reporters were taken to this. It's a fraud to call it a little red schoolhouse. It's the biggest, dullest industrial building you ever saw in your life. I mean, it's a terrible looking building. It's like a junior college school would be here. And the French have done very little with it either, because, you know, the French attitude towards the surrender was quite different from ours. They did not have any grand part in our winning the surrender from the Germans. So they have not done much with it. They made some changes recently and improved the building some and made a tourist attraction out of it. But you can go to Reims and not realize it's there unless you start looking for it. So Jodl was flown in just a few minutes before the correspondents came up from Paris. And that word correspondence is a bad habit I've gotten into from being on television. The word reporter is a much better word. But Jodl told Eisenhower through an intermediary that he wanted 48 hours so that he could get permission from Dönitz. Admiral Dönitz had taken over after Hitler committed suicide, and he was heading the German government in Berlin. Eisenhower refused to give Jodl permission to have 48 hours more, but he did give him permission to wire Dönitz for permission to sign the surrender. Well, it was 2 a.m. now, on the early morning of May 7th now. And the reporters were brought upstairs about 2:15, and it was a mob scene. They had a chalk line on the floor behind this table. I've been to the room a lot, and the table, it's a grand table about as long as this and wider, and it has it's painted black with a great patina on it, and there are scratches in it or indentations where people have written with ballpoint pens. And the reporters were brought up there and placed behind it so they wouldn't interfere. And at something like It was by this time 2:30 in the morning, and Jodl came in, and there were 14 Allied people, German, British, Russian, and American, assembled around this table, and the three Germans, Jodl and two others. And the photographers were the way photographers always are, you know, they were climbing up the ceiling, and they had ladders and everything. And meanwhile, a lot of the reporters in Paris were sore. They got where they weren't fools. They knew something big was happening, and it could only be the surrender. So they had, a lot of them had driven up to Reims, and they were outside this building, and they wanted to get in. Saw no reason why they couldn't get in. Well, they were not allowed in, and that got ugly. Eisenhower was in his office upstairs on the 3rd floor of this building. The actual map room where the surrender took place was on the 2nd floor. And I think that Eisenhower never came to the surrender, to the signing, and obviously he thought it would be more humiliating for the German officers to surrender to his aides than to himself. And it was just a little sticking it to him. And I was amused to see in later years that Winston Churchill did the same thing to Jodl. He refused to call him by his German name. He called him Jodl the whole time. So Jodl signed the thing, and then he stood up, and he was choking back tears by this time, and he said, with this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the victor's hands. In this hour, I can only express the hope that the victor will treat them with generosity. Well, Jodl must have forgotten that most of the reporters there and some of the generals had just come from Buchenwald, and it was a bad time for the Germans to ask for mercy, really. It fell on deaf ears. The ceremony lasted for less than 5 minutes, and then apparently Jodl was taken upstairs and did meet Eisenhower then, and the 17 reporters were taken back to Paris. Well, you can imagine how uneasy they were. They didn't know when they were going to have the story released, and they had filed in the order as they wrote the stories, and their stories were to be sent out in the order in which they were filed. Boyd Lewis of the United Press had the first story out, and Jim Kilgallen of the INS had the second story written, and Ed Kennedy of the Associated Press was third, and they trailed on after that. But they were going to dispatch those stories once it was released in that order. So they were just sitting around Paris, and everybody wanted to know when. Well, SHAEF headquarters said it could be the next day or the day after. Eisenhower had promised the Russians that he would not release it until the Germans had surrendered to them in Berlin the next day. Purely political decision. So at about 10:30 that morning, the morning of the 7th now, something called Flensburg Radio was the only German radio transmitter still working. And over Flensburg Radio came a story ordering all German forces to lay down their arms and not fire another shot. Well, Ed Kennedy, who was head of the AP contingent in Europe, decided that that was enough for him. He thought that SHAEF must have given Flensburg Radio permission to do that, or an order to do that. And he said that he felt that released him from his promise not to send out the story until SHAEF released the news. So Kennedy went to the office of Colonel Richard Merrick, whom we all knew. He was the head censor. He's a nice guy. The censors always are. That's the hell of it. And he went with a friend a lot of us knew, Relman Pat Morin. And he went up there with him, and he said, "Listen, Colonel, I'm going to send this story out." Well, Merrick was furious, and they were controlling all the channels of communication. So Merrick said, "Go ahead, just try and get it out. Do what you want. You'll never get it out." Well, I don't know how he did it, but Kennedy found some kind of a phone line to London, and it was a bad line apparently, and he had another guy in the office, Mort Goodbrod, read the story to the office in London, and of course they got it right to New York. By this time it was 9:38 New York time, and that was it further confuses the thing, because at 9:38 p.m. New York time, it was now May 8th in Europe. So Kennedy got the story out, it was released, and there was joy everywhere, all over the world, on the strength of Ed Kennedy's story. Well, you can imagine how the other reporters felt. I mean, they were ready to kill him. But Kennedy's position was that the world had waited for 5 long years for this, and that it was wrong to withhold this great bit of information for even one 24-hour period, simply because a military general had made a political promise to an ally, the Russians. Kennedy was banned from Europe. Every AP staff member in all of Europe, including London, had their credentials lifted, so they could not work. So several days later, the AP did get most of their staff back, but Kennedy was banned from Europe, and he was sent back to New York in disgrace. And he took a freighter back to New York, and he went into the AP office when he got back, and they really didn't want any part of him. They never gave him an assignment. And after he'd been there about 4 weeks, he found a check for $4,900 deposited in his bank account. And while they never said so in so many words, he knew that that was severance pay, and he was done at the AP. It's a sad story, and I, having been there and angry at him at the time, I have never been able to decide for myself whether Ed Kennedy did the right thing or the wrong thing. He was distraught because his reputation had been destroyed, and every other newsman hated him. He went to his 2 senators, and more than a year later, 1946, late 1946, he got a letter signed by Walter Bedell Smith, Beadle Smith, Eisenhower's aide, and it said this: Ludwig Schwerin von Krosigk did officially announce the unconditional surrender in a broadcast to the German people and to the world from Flensburg, Germany. This announcement was made pursuant to orders from Supreme Headquarters that the German troops were to be informed by every possible means of the surrender. So, really, Kennedy was exonerated, at least in his own mind. He got all his credentials back and was free to work abroad again, including on military bases if he wanted to, but he never did. He was severely wounded. He went out to Santa Barbara and went to work as editor of a small newspaper there. All those events that took place, I was there writing stories for the Stars and Stripes. And it's selfish, but every one of those great events, Roosevelt's death or Ernie's death or the meeting at Torgau, it just brings up memories of my own day at that time, my own life. I remember specifically, it's a terrible story to tell on myself, I remember hearing that Roosevelt had died. I was traveling with a great NBC reporter named George Hicks. He was one of the good ones and a dandy guy. And we stopped somewhere along the way for some food at a GI place, and we heard that Roosevelt had died. We continued on trying to get back to the press camp. We had stories to write having nothing to do with that, and we were getting low on gas. It was dusty, and we had a terrible trip. And we could not get our jerry can filled with gas. I got back, went to bed that night, and all I could think of, I mean, I thought of Roosevelt, but all I could think of was how I was going to get gas for that Jeep the next morning. And I have been embarrassed with myself ever since. But we take these things and translate them in terms of our own lives. I did the same thing at Torgau. I mean, here was the end of the war, really. When we cut Germany in two and met the Russians at the Elbe River at Torgau, it was the end of the war. For me, it was just a great story. I ran into this lieutenant who had led his troops into Torgau, 69th Infantry Division, and he thought it would be proper to have some grand display. He thought this was such a ceremonial day, and everybody was, Russians and Americans were hugging and everything. So he had the guys, they broke into this drugstore, and he got a sheet. And he got all these bottles of stuff in the drugstore, and he laid this thing on the ground, and he made an American flag out of the stuff, bottled stuff they had in the drugstore, and he hung that flag made with pharmaceuticals. It was, I mean, grand days like that stick in your memory. Then the Hohner Harmonica factory was in Torgau. Well, it seemed as though I got to like the Russians just that day. They were a lot like American soldiers, only about more so. They were twice as much like American soldiers as Americans. They were crazy is what they were. Saw one guy on a bicycle that he'd picked up, you know, and the other fellow had a German Schmeiser, the little machine pistol, and he got down and he was trying to shoot the tires out on his friend's bicycle without hitting him. I mean, they're wild, nuts. So they broke into the Hohner Harmonica factory, and every Russian had either a harmonica or an accordion. And the Germans who had been interned, the Russians who had been interned and forced to work for the Germans, realized we were about to meet the Russians. So they started following along behind our troops. Well, one of the women who was in that group had been a soloist with the Moscow Opera. And she, with these Russian soldiers, they had a chorus, and it must be the greatest musical event of the century. Gordon Fraser and George Hicks had a wire recorder there, and I understand that it was broadcast, but I don't know what wire recorders is, and they probably had to go over it after that, and it was lost forever. But it was some day in my life, and I imagine sales are just going to burn. All right, I'm going to do some questions if I can. If I answer questions better than I speak, really. You do this?
Yes, several people wanted to know if you can share your experiences on Utah Beach a little bit with them.
Well, I can. And, you know, I don't want to condemn any of my comrades, but it's very clear who was on Omaha and who was not. I was not on Omaha Beach D-Day. I came into Utah D4, and it was not a safe place to be even then. It was, the boys were all laid out on the beach. The Graves Registration Unit had collected the boys from wherever they had died, from out, hung on the barbed wire offshore and floating in the water. Bodies all float face down. That's things I learned I didn't know. And they had laid them out, and they had covered with blankets. And they did not cover their shoes, their boots. And I remember thinking that day, all those boots so much the same on boys so different, I can weep thinking of it today. Yes, how about a funny question?
Well, we don't have too many funny ones, but coming to today, what's your opinion of the Enola Gay controversy at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum?
Oh, that's a little out of my line. I see absolutely nothing wrong with displaying the Enola Gay, and to translate it in terms of my own war, I saw nothing wrong with what happened at Dresden. I know exactly why. the British bombed Dresden, although it was not really a big military target. We joined in. It was the British idea to bomb Dresden, and we were their allies, so we said, okay, we'll go along, and we'll come in after you go in at night and do it in the daytime. But the British were just so furious at what the Germans had done to their country that they were determined that the Germans would, every one of them, even in a town as nice as Dresden and as culturally eminent, that they would goddamn well know what the war was like there too, in the best place in all of Germany. That's why the British did it. It was pure vengeance. And it's not nice, but I understand it. And the Enola Gay, that's a cousin to the thought, I see no reason why the Enola Gay, it was an important thing in American history, and I don't see any reason to bury it.
You recall when General Patton slapped a, quote, battle-fatigued soldier at a hospital in Italy? What's the real story of that?
Well, the real story is that Patton was a 5-letter word beginning with P that I can't mention on broadcast air. And he certainly did slap the person. And I've been a little too strong with this, but I had nothing but contempt for Patton. I have gotten a lot of flack for it, but I did not think he was a good general. Thought he got too many American boys killed for his own glory. And the Third Army was a great army with, as far as the people, personnel went, he had as good as any. But it got much more glory than it deserved because it made a lot of distance, but it wasn't going anywhere. It was headed for Nice or Marseille, and the First Army was fighting its way across Europe. It had a couple of armored divisions. The First Army had 9, and there was no comparison. I spoke at a thing at Cantini in Chicago last year, and there was a very good historian. I like him a lot. He's written books on Patton. And he stood up and said that Patton was primarily responsible for the victory in Normandy. Well, my gosh, Patton wasn't in Normandy. Patton, I'm not sure where the border is between Normandy and Brittany, but Patton did not, his Third Army was not committed until after we went through St. Lo, which was August 23rd. And by that time, we broke out. And Patton's Third Army was activated, I believe, on the 24th or 25th of August. The war was all over in Normandy once we broke through at St. Lo. So Patton had nothing whatsoever to do. Patton's only contribution to our victory in Normandy was one that he was eminently well suited for. He was in charge of a totally non-existent army in the south of England. They had all these secret messages that they knew the Germans could intercept, and they had this huge ghost force in the south of England trying to convince the Germans that they were going to land, that the attack was coming from there. Patton was in command of it, and of course you could not hide Patton, and that was exactly the purpose of it. He was in command of this non-existent army so that it would attract attention to it and the Germans would think that it existed. That was the best job Patton did. I had some rude remarks to make about Patton. I'm getting better at it. I'm throwing myself into it more. And I had some remarks to make on an ABC show a while back. So it evoked the best letter I ever got. It was critical, but it was from Patton's daughter, and I'll bet I like her. She said, "Dear Mr. Rooney, my father wouldn't have liked you either, period, sincerely."
Is the military better or worse at dealing with reporters these days?
Not close, worse. Can you imagine that In London, we were told the night before that there was going to be a raid the next day. They trusted us to that extent. Now, if they're going on a raid tomorrow, you're lucky if they tell you Sunday that they've been on it already. No, the military has done a foolish thing. They have censorship during World War II was sensible. We tried to keep information that might help the Germans, keep it from them. And reporters knew what that was. There was not much censorship. Not many things got crossed out of your stories. And when they were crossed out, it was usually justified. The censors were sensible people, and they didn't take out anything just on whim. But the object was to keep information away from the Germans. Now, military censorship is designed only to keep information away from the American public. Now, there's something wrong there.
All right, you mentioned flack before. Do you get flack from continuing to criticize Lawrence Tisch? And is any part of your conversation with Mr. Tisch repeatable?
The answer to the last is no. I can't imagine how I could tell the story of my phone call with him. But yeah, I do get a lot of flack. And the best thing that happens to me is people come up to me in the hall and say, "Hey, right on, Andy. Boy, I wish I'd said that." It makes me feel very good. I mean, if the boss calls, I don't care. I am an independent person, and I have established myself as an independent position because I'm part of a show that's bringing in a lot of money for CBS. And I have said some things that someone else might have gotten fired for. I do think if they seriously resent what I say, they should fire me. Now, I said that to an agent, and he said, "Well, I don't think the truth is reason for being fired." So, but it has not been easy for me. I don't like being disliked by anybody, including my boss. And I have said this, but any boss I have an unfair advantage over him, and it's not right, really. Over the years, I have had so many bosses that I have developed this experience, and so that I am so much more experienced being bossed than they are at bossing, that it's very difficult for them.
All right, let's move on to Dan and Connie. What is the real inside story of their relationship? Love, hate, what?
Well, I have tried to make it clear that my complaint about Dan and Connie as an anchor team is not with either of them. They have established their credentials. Dan Rather is one of the best reporters in the business, and he could write for the New York Times or the Washington Post. He could do anything. He is a very good reporter. Connie Chung is a very experienced person who has done a great many good things, and I have no complaint whatsoever with them. I mean, my complaint is with the idea of an anchor team. It's just not a journalistic situation. They are put in the position of being actors. I mean, they have got to respond, and they have got to think about that too. It's got to strike them, well, am I looking pleased enough at what he just said or what she just said? And this is nothing that a news person ought to have to worry about. So it's the idea that's wrong. There's nothing wrong with the people involved in it. It's just not working. And they say they don't know how to get out of it. Why don't they just say, we thought this was a good idea, and it turns out it isn't, so we aren't going to do it anymore. That's all they have to do.
here's a hypothetical question. Now,
I'm not going to be quoted at all, am I?
No,
Because I don't want to get... Why do I do this to myself?
Background. But if CBS decides to follow your suggestion, it's not working, and dumps Dan Rather, how would you like to co-anchor the evening news with Connie Chung?
You know, naturally you think about doing other things. I have often thought I'd like to have a spot on the CBS morning show. I'm on the same floor with them and a lot of people I like there. And I've often thought it would be fun to be able to have a desk on the set. And I would just sit there, and every time I had an idea, I would wrap my thing, and I would speak my piece, whatever it was. And the title of my spot would be "Wait a Damn Minute" with Andy Rooney.
Well, looking at CBS more broadly, is the reputation of CBS, which once was called the Tiffany Network, being squandered today in contrast with the end of World War II and that golden era, being squandered by keeping an eye only on the bottom line?
Well, I think that question answers itself. My gosh, haven't I said enough about that? Is there any doubt about what I think, really? I do think it is a sad fact that the network news operation has deteriorated. It was one of the great news organizations in the world. And it's partially for the same reason that a lot of news organizations have deteriorated. CBS is not alone. And I have the feeling that the reason is that reporting is so expensive. Good reporting is expensive. So they aren't doing much of it anymore. And the reason that it's expensive is that a reporter doesn't get a story every time he goes out looking for one. It used to be, we had a staff here in Washington, and they all had beats. They knew the people on it. And if something came along, they got the story. But if nothing came along, they came back empty that night. Well, now, what's more apt to happen, the desk says, gives a reporter a sheet of paper and says, this is the story. Go stand in front of something and tell it. I mean, there are still some good reporters in television, but a lot of them are still good reporters, but are just going out and doing a story that does not involve turning over any new facts. The word reporter, it's difficult. I mean, I think all of us here in this room think of the word reporter in possibly with false definition, because when you say reporter, I suppose it means someone who tells a story about something. And we think of it, I imagine most of you do, and I do, I think of a reporter as somebody who not only tells it, but who first gathers, collects the information, and digs it out. So maybe we need to have a new name. But it is sad, and there is so much reporting to be done that is not being done, not only by CBS, by everyone. I find the business community to be vastly underreported. It's very difficult. It's much easier to do a story about corruption in government than it is to do a story about corruption in business, because government tries to keep things secret, but ultimately things come out in government. And they do not always come out in business. And it takes a damn good story to get a reporter to get a story out of a corporation that's worth anything. A lot of work to be done there. I know I'm not answering these questions, but I'm just going to where I can talk easily and say something. Because I know we have 7 minutes left.
All right, let's talk about public television. Do you think it's necessary? And secondly, do you think that in the light of apparent budget cutbacks on Capitol Hill, that the commercial broadcasting companies should contribute to a trust fund to keep public television alive? I
have a great friend, one of my best friends, the most trusted man in America, though not by me. But Walter's a great dear friend of mine. And I was arguing with him about this. He's on the board at Channel 13 in New York. And I said what I think about it. I said, I don't see why public NPR doesn't say, the hell with the government. We're going to strike out on our own, and we're not going to take this money anymore. We're not going to subject ourselves to the pressure we have been under for all these years. We're going to find a way. They say 20%. They get 20% from the government. They ought to damn well find a way to get that 20% somewhere else so that, like any decent news organization, they could be totally independent of the government. I see no excuse for it. Now, it's unfair to Walter because I must say he had a very good argument about all the stations in the country that couldn't go on without it, that we'd lose a lot of the smaller stations. That may be true. I must say I'm ignorant of the details of the thing. But certainly, philosophically, in broad terms, there is no doubt that public broadcasting, radio or television, should be independent of the government.
Thank you. You've given us your views of General Patton. Now, who was the most admired general in World War II in your mind, and why?
Oh, there's no question. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the most admired man. I thought, I revered Eisenhower. I thought he was a gentleman. I thought he was a good tactician. I thought he was honest and direct. A really fine man. I went to my first press conference on 20 Grosvenor Square. I was been on the paper just a few months, and I was assigned to an Eisenhower press conference. And I sat at this table, and there were these experienced reporters there. One of them was Gladwin Hill, the Associated Press, great friend of mine, died last year. He was with the AP and then later with the New York Times. And I remember taking notes, everything Eisenhower said. And he, you know, Eisenhower was done a great discredit because people started, he finally allowed his press conference when he became president to be printed verbatim. And like anyone else, he does not speak in perfectly intact grammatical sentences. I would hate to have to punctuate the things I have said here today and make sentences out of them. And Eisenhower was particularly rambling sometimes, but I sat there making notes at this press conference, and so I went back to the office, and I had them all in order. So I was so young at the business, I thought you started with what he said first and then wrote the story going. So the wire service story comes in, and right near the end of what he was saying, Eisenhower had said, well, the invasion will be this year. And this was 4.5, you know, it was not that far off. So Gladwin Hill says, his lead, Eisenhower says D-Day, invasion to be this year. I had it buried the last thing in my story, and it was a learning experience for me. But the other very good, there were a lot of good generals, a lot of bad generals, but some very good ones. I had a friend named Maurice Rose who was commander of the 3rd Armored Division, and he was killed night after I had written a story about him. I had a good time with him. And Courtney Hodges of the First Army, the huge First Army, basically fought the war, much bigger than the 7th, the 9th, or the 3rd. And it was the bulk of the American Army fighting its way across France and Germany. And Courtney Hodges, who ever heard of Courtney Hodges? Nobody. But he was vastly superior to Patton in every regard.
Thank you. Before we get to our final question, well, before I do, let me just slip in one here. A couple of people asked, do you see Colin Powell as the next Ike?
I don't know. You know who's Plugging Colin Powell big, I spent last weekend with Steve Ambrose, the one man who wrote the very good book on D-Day last year. And Steve is working for Colin Powell and is convinced he should be our next president. I'm not sure that he will be or can be. For one thing, he hasn't said anything. I don't know. He seems like a great person, but you got to find out. Where does he stand on abortion, on all these problems? I mean, people were always asking Cronkite to run for president, and he said, wait till they find out I'd take every gun in America away from anyone who ever owned one. See if they still want me for president. And so we had to find out that about Colin Powell, although I don't think he'd take the guns away.
All right, before we get to that last question, which I have postponed, here's a certificate of appreciation, sir, for being with us today, as well as a National Press Club coffee mug.
This is what I really came for.
This will keep you awake on your tour.
I can't thank you enough.
Last question, sir. How old is your typewriter? And is it tough to get it repaired?
There's a man named Titel in New York who can fix any of them, and there's a fellow who was for years the fixer for the New York Times. He came in last week. My typewriter was born the year I was, 1919. Oh, really? It's an Underwood 5. But I don't want to lie to you. I use a computer and I write my letters on the typewriter.
Thank you very much for being with us. Enjoyed your talk. Thank you all. And I'm sure any of our distinguished guests at the head table will stay for a few minutes if you want to ask them any questions about their experiences during World War II. Thank you for being with us, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Monroe Carmen. I'm president of the club and editor-at-large at Bloomberg Business News. I'd like to welcome our club members in the audience with their guests, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio or the Global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, which is a very distinguished head table today, I would like to remind our members of future speakers. On Tuesday, May 16th, Sarah Brady of Handgun Control and Tanya Metaxa of the National Rifle Association will debate the assault weapons ban and assorted gun control issues. And on Wednesday, May 17th, Myrlie Evers Williams of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People talks about affirmative action and the lessons of Brown versus the Board of Education. And on May 22nd, comedian Bob Newhart will give us his perspective on the General Chenault. And he was an ace, meaning he shot down 5 or more enemy planes. He flew F-86s in the Korean conflict and was an early Air Force jet test pilot. He's been deputy director of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and still serves as a senior advisor there. The latest of his 4 books is just out. Ken Blackshaw, from the Nantucket Enquirer and Mirror, he got his first lieutenant wings and piloted B-17 bombers with the U.S. 8th Air Force over Europe. Ken is current commander of the National Press Club American Legion post. Austin Kiplinger After service as a Navy career pilot in the war in the South Pacific, he helped launch the magazine Changing Times. Later, he was a columnist for the Chicago Journal of Commerce, an ABC and NBC newsman in Chicago, an editor, an author. He's been a member of the National Press Club for 50 years. And now he has some association with Kiplinger Washington editors. Joe Layton, an old friend of mine, was a Reuters war correspondent in the Pacific. He covered the Japanese political campaigns. They never change, he says, just the faces. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-672-2334. That's a little bit of a change, 1-800-672-2334. If you have any questions now, we have cards on your tables. Write them on those cards, pass them up, and I will ask as many as time permits. This week we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the ending of World War II in Europe, VE Day. I must tell you, during World War II, I had a shiny white helmet and a luminous sash and belt. And I played a rather important role in that conflict. I was a messenger, a civil defense messenger. Fortunately, I was never given any messages to deliver. Fortunately, the United States was neither bombed nor invaded in those years, 1941 to 45. He surrendered 50 years ago in September on the battleship Missouri. He became a reliable source for newsmen as spokesman at the Pentagon, the Treasury, deputy press secretary at the White House, and later he was ombudsman for the Washington Post. Don Larrabee, a correspondent and public affairs officer for the Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater. Sergeant Larrabee was there when MacArthur entered Japan in August 1945. He owned and operated the Griffin Larrabee News Bureau here, serving at one time more than 20 client newspapers. Marvin Stone, my former editor. I still choke when I mention that word. Marvin served as a lieutenant aboard a Navy combat ship in the Pacific Theater during the war. He is the former editor of U.S. News and World Report and presently serves as chairman of the International Media Fund. Mark Johnson, a correspondent for Media General News Service and chairman of the MPC Speakers Committee. Hale Montgomery, a member. Our guests at the head table, however, came a lot closer to the war than I. They all served our country and served it well in different ways during that war to end all wars. Back then and since then, they have made distinctive contributions both to American journalism, American literature, and American history. So I'm going to depart a little bit from custom and take a few moments to give you brief snapshots of the careers of our guests, but I ask you to hold your applause, please, until all are introduced. From my left and your right, Bill Frank. Much to the anger of publisher Sissy Patterson, the military came into the old Washington Times-Herald and recruited, that's a nice way of saying they grabbed, 8 able-bodied staffers out of the newsroom in 1942. Bill was one of those. He was a Marine Corps combat correspondent in the Solomon Islands and other Pacific campaigns. Donald Lopez, a fighter pilot in World War II. Don flew P-40s in the China Theater